voicing is really, my friends, something like sculpting. A film director directing your gaze on something specific rather than you picking it on the theater stage, because you're directed by the voicing to follow a pattern or a melodic line. It's very striking in Beethoven's Funeral Symphony, Funeral March of the Symphony. The ostinato of the rhythm and the note of the E corresponds to the space that would take the steps of a march that would be funeral and stately. And the melodic line is embedded inside. And in an orchestration, as Beethoven does, the proportions of the voicing and the layered, structured or presentation of the texture of the soundscape is in the proportions of the orchestra instruments in terms of their projection. Whenever on the piano one can not voice, many do, or some voice, but demonstratively to a point where perhaps the attention as an artistic director, the performer, brings you to follow one. Therefore, by putting in shadow or darkness, chiaroscuro, the other parts. In the Nocturne by Fauré, it's on the top. What a beautiful phrase. I had to play it even for the example fully. And of course, the indication on the score by the composer in the manuscript, or the publisher in the edition, and therefore the opinion from the teachers, the scholars, the publishers of different editions after the first edition, don't always present, not almost ever actually, the percentage of voicing, how much to bring out and how much to hold back. Is it blending and slightly rising above, or is it really strikingly brought out? In a Bach chorale, because of the organ stops registration, then it becomes clear that you hear in a chorale like O Mensch bewein. Naturally played on the piano, you have to make choices how to present the soundscape. The eloquence of the ornamented and decorated chorale, the organ prelude which Bach wrote after improvising it, was clearly an eloquence that has to be brought out very clearly in an orchestration. It could be an oboe with a piercing sound compared to a flute, which will have more mellow sound. In the beginning of the Sonatine by Ravel, sandwiches the accompaniment among an octavization of the melody. And not where he could have used in a string quartet viola, violin, cello, and have more spacings. Here on the piano he bunches the hands together, but he octaves it, so it gives more energy to the sound without to have to forcefully prevail. And when it stays only solidly after the few first bars on the top, he doesn't octave it anymore. So he modulates the choices of necessity, how much to bring out, how much to blend, how much to merge, how much to flourish, how much to blossom, how much to just raise as the sun perhaps rising. Beethoven does that in the last movement of the Waldstein Sonata. This welcoming sunrise, almost a chorale or an anthem for wishing for the future, reassurance, consolation, but not rather the accompaniment blending together. Of course, in the piano is a percussive instrument. The patterns of fast notes that are obviously in a different, let's say, arpeggiation or scales, you hear it more because the decay of the long value lets the sound die whenever the pattern of the fast notes keep maintaining that little flame or perhaps a flow of water, but constantly renewed. And so the length of sound of the melody almost decays while you have to play softer, this murmur, that whisper. And the choices of how much you bring out or how much you don't bring out or how much you try to blend with the accompaniment depends also of the placement in the registration by the composer's choice on the piano. Fauré's first barcarolle is in the middle. He could have written sense of voice or human voice, mezza voce, middle voice, not whispered nor screamed, in the sense not brought as an operatic soprano with a high note. Naturally an alto voice. And the taste then comes in play, how much to bring out, how much to not, especially more difficultly so to define when you play a fugue, like D sharp minor book 1 of the Well-Temperate. Very little rhythmic pattern, mostly singing patterns of neighboring tones, step motion, and soft suspensions. Third voice. accompaniment in a fugue. There are only voices that are thematic, that are in fact storytelling. If you play something where you have a clear aria style, like slow movement of the Italian concerto by Bach, you establish already the soundscape, or probably the sound carpet, and then the aria. Or Chopin in a prelude. And the repeated notes in Mozart K310. Chopin uses one prelude also for the opposite. The melody in the left hand. And the chords pounding in the right hand. Mozart uses it in the left hand. When he played it in the top, in the exposition. And the problem often in the fugue is that you have to follow the voices, so it's an intense listening of dialogues between people who say meaningful things at the same time. So it demands so much attention from the listener, an attuned ear trained to hear the patterns, the intervals, the leaps, the delays, the effects, the expression that results from that. And in an aria style or in a singing style like the waltz in Chopin, here the soundscape is evident. You don't have to combine. In the Sinfonia of Cantata 42, Bach uses oboe and strings, and therefore it's an eloquent top-note melodic expression of narrative conviction with this rhetorical persuasion. Stravinsky's Firebird Lullaby. Where the melodies in the same kissing range as the accompaniment pattern. And in the same nostalgic mood, Mussorgsky's pictures Old Castle. He spreads a paired octave. 117 Brahms intermezzo is in the top, and then sneaks in the middle. And the E flat ostinatos are around. Separated or register fragmented. Sometimes it's a real effect. When Ravel uses the slow movement of his concerto for two hands, he really mirrors the soundscape structure of the Italian concerto by Bach slow movement. So, in middle range, and the melody singing with a softer accompaniment, but the accompaniment has its own inner life. Or this. When he writes Ravel his left hand concerto, of course, given the hand's construction, the thumb is on the melodic top usual part. And so when he does the second theme, the accompaniment is in the weaker fingers, 3, 4, 5, and the melody is in the thumb, which is the stronger finger. But when you play it irregular disposition of the hand, in the right hand on the top for the melody as a soprano, then Schubert in his Moments musicaux, impromptu. So you have to play very softly, precisely from close up, these arpeggios that flourish the melodic harmonization, and then but you have to develop strength in the weak fingers, like in the last movement of his last sonata. He didn't write natural for a pianist, instead of strengthening the weak finger to play with intensity the melody. Of course, in Ravel, being for the left hand, the weak finger is the strong finger, being the thumb. Also, the accompaniment often highlights the melody, which by itself, like in the Beethoven sonata, appears banal, three notes in conjunction, and then the harmonization with chords that stay. He doesn't get it. But in the Tempest Sonata he does. top, crossing over or played by the right hand. And then the motoric violas holding the pattern, continuing, proposing this perpetual motion. And then second theme. By eighth notes of 2 rather than eighth notes of 3. Second theme of Pathétique, he plays repeated chords, and then the right hand playing above and under. Voicing, it's more about contrasting register completion of a fragmented melodic line, which is single. His last theme, movements theme rather, sorry, it has the same pattern as the second theme of the first movement, but broken into different registration. So it becomes a dialogue, but at least with space on which you hear the dialogue, let's say bassoon oboe. Whenever Prokofiev, in the second theme of his third sonata, embeds the canonic imitation in the same hand. If he had to present it with better spacing to hear it really layered easily for the listener and the performer to play, it would have been but that comes to my thought about how much the composer wanted to be layered or how much the composer wanted to blend, or in a cunning way sometimes, purposely placing it all in the same hand so that the difference of sounds, even if you can obtain voicing by shadow and lights, still has a certain level of embedded combination. Because one can choose to play it exactly at the same level and hear it twice, rather than Beethoven in 109's variation does but this is indicated in the score, so it's visually clear with the stems up and down how they overlap and hold in a way of crossing, overlapping of the voices, instead of hearing each new voice come as a step. It's every second. If he does that few variations later, because the overlapping entrance brings our attention somewhere else, or rather our distraction. But we don't follow the ending of the phrase, which is the dropping six, while the other part starts. These are situations where the performer is perplexed about, did the composer really want, wished, imagined, or conceived such layering on an instrument that is basically percussive with relatively shorter decay in 18th century times fortepianos than today, but still, Fauré, in his 13th Nocturne's peak moment, he writes this chorale of half and whole notes and then decorative eighth notes in triplets. So using the pedal, it sounds blurry. If I use the middle pedal, I can separate. And I remember asking Mademoiselle Boulanger, who studied with him, perhaps not that piece, but his idiom anyway, as a composer. And she said he wanted to hear the combination of the two, but in transparency, as if it's not supposed to be completely separated. First of all, he didn't use the middle pedal that today's pianos have, but it's written as if. So if you keep the pedal of the right foot, it becomes blurry. If you take it off, you lose the chord. Or, so she said to play very soft, perhaps one detached, one less, but compared to the chord. Right, and then brass and harp. That is drastic in terms of contrast, of timbre, colors, imagination, which the piano is mostly for the shadows and lights, but still. So the composers didn't shy writing things that either were not possible on their instrument, either that they didn't hope it would be, because they imagined that the intent was more important than the result. For instance, Bach's first prelude from Book 2. You would think he probably restruck it in order to repeat it, because if not, he would have sounded like... He didn't restrike it. Perhaps he just thought that this is enough. Notationally, it doesn't write to, it's not notated to restrike. That once you have it in mind, of course on the organ you can hold it and hear it. I can hold what he could anyway, because of the pipes and the air, to keep that ostinato bass. But in the harpsichord notation for the Book 2 first prelude, I don't hear it, but I keep it in mind. That he was an organist, and he did write for the harpsichord. I don't think he restricted himself from instrumental, vocal, or a type of instrument. He just wrote the intervals and the musical expression of the voicing and patterns that motivically brings him to do what he was convinced he wanted to convey. Of course, on the organ you have more opportunities to hold sounds that don't decay. But then on the other hand, you also cover the thematic materials by holding louder the decaying voice, which it's a negative and positive option of interpretation. When Chopin writes the E-flat minor etude, he places the two hands very close. dramatic accompaniment. Very reflective, very intensely middle voice. And sometimes Beethoven, inspired probably by Bach, fragments it to the point to which he doesn't voice, he doesn't hold, but he wants everything to be really almost as if powdered in the Passacaglia in C minor for organ. He uses this staccati instead of playing the chords. And in the earlier variations in 109, Beethoven does. So it's another way to, I think, voice by omission, by adding air, interrupted silences. And in the Passacaglia for organ, of course, it's first in the bass. That you hear the melody of the Passacaglia lament. So in my transcription, I sometimes used to play out, hinting the notes of the theme. So here. But I gave up on that because I thought that's the whole point of him, to atomize it. It's not for me to make it more readable. When he wants to be intense and full of decoration, opposite of interrupted silences. So over full or over empty. And Monsieur Boulanger used to love very much the crossed thumbs in Schumann's dispositions. The tenor above the alto crossing the voices. In the SATB, like in the Fantasy for piano disposition, and not chord and melody. Or string quartet writing, like Mozart's D minor quartet. Or in the pathetic slow movement. And the melodic line of the melody on the top is thematic, but the accompaniment bass line is not just roots for harmonic patterns of tonics and dominants. The second melody, sandwiching the accompaniment pattern. Like Mozart's quartet I played earlier. He purposely omits the downbeats to let the melody appear alone and then harmonize it. Fauré does very often that in his Sixth Nocturne. Area of the 13th Nocturne, which, by the way, he starts in contrapuntal unaccompaniment, just 4 parts, so 3 at first, then 4, if you head in. What the listener can more easily absorb than the intensity of continuous lines, which have to be hierarchized, but all meant, especially with the singing bass line too, not just an accompaniment line. There's virtue to simplicity and virtue to complexity. As long as the intent and the inspiration is clearly driven with some kind of narrative pattern. In the Berg Sonata, you cannot dissociate the melody from the coating of the other voices that harmonize it, but polyphonically. When Fauré goes into the arpeggios, like harp, in the Sixth Nocturne later, and the melody is on top. But still, the melodic note of the bass has that expressive leap of the octave up. And it's so easy to get distracted by the beauty of this. Flower smells and tree looks good, and this plant is interesting. Oh, and this bird, and oh, this, that. It's difficult but important to maintain the continuum of attention, not just because it's polyphonic as a fugue by essence, but also to shape sculpturally the even sort of say packed chords, like beginning of Fourth Concerto Beethoven, and not consider them as chords but more as like voices of a chorale, or of a choir rather. It's sometimes not found very necessary by many pianists to think that they need to voice everything, included non-polyphonic music. I find that it brings a lot of balance for the structures when composers write heavy basses, and if they can be voiced some more, and the fifth finger echo down, softer, more depth and power. Because either these will be all loud, equally, or equally soft, but when it's voiced, then you clear some space for the other voices. In the written scores for the instrument to take away the octaves in the left hand, because that's what made the balance in the concept of the registrations by the composer, even if today's piano is thicker in the basses, therefore in literal translation ends up by betraying the piece, because then all of a sudden the left hand octaves become louder when they're meant to just balance. And so voicing is a way to make up for playing on an instrument for which it was not intended. But not everybody agrees on such translation. In the opening of 109's first movement, Beethoven has subtly the melody inside the pattern of arpeggios of the accompaniment, all in the same area, in hand. He doesn't per se ask to hear. Some kind of statement of an instrument that projects, and then the harmonization in this ethereal harp arpeggios. I agree even that in this example, Devil's Advocate, it's too much, because the composer wrote the stems, but at the same time put them in the same hand and not away. So that then he intended, therefore, the blending of the material to the point to which you don't voice at all. Or you voice a little more than less, but not too much. I think the composers choose the soundscapes they want to create, but they don't, in orchestration, yes, but in piano, don't dosage it by saying 30% mezzo piano, 40% mezzo pianissimo, perhaps mezzo forte, not more. Debussy does more of this kind of things than other composers, and of course Berg, Schoenberg, very specific about details of these subtle micro-layerings. But does it always appear so when played, like the beginning of Debussy's Reflection on the Water? Where the motif appears part of the surrounded harmonization. These kind of textures let the listener wonder and marvel and imagine, perhaps better than if it's super directively defined. Schumann wrote in the slow movement of his sonata in G minor, Mozart's G major concerto, slow movement. So I'm not going to go into the look-alikeness, borrowing or stealing or homaging. But the fact that the two composers chose to express serene C major with the most beautifully simple triad and repeated chords or intervals, and a melodic line that is barely moving other than by step motion. somebody like Scriabin does a lot of these leaps. But everything else also secondary voice in dialogue, contradiction, or compassionate emotion, and the chordal pounding of the harmonization, and all that in a flow of expressive downpour, outpour, or any pour. And all of them are so sincere, so honest in their expression, as if they put in their hand the best of humanity of theirs and give us the chance to share it by receiving it before we transmit it.